Biff taught at the University of Washington for more than 45 years. He led promotion of scholarly relations between the US and academic institutions in Thailand, Vietnam, China, and Japan. While a faculty member at the University of Washington, he supervised 45 PhD students, 20 of whom were from Asia and half of whom were women. He specifically trained 10 students from Thailand and 6 from Vietnam, who have shaped the development of their profession in their home countries. I would also like to, as we have previously, acknowledge Professor Kais and his wife Jane as the ones who generously funded the Kais Endowment that has provided funding through the years to so many Southeast Asia students through the Kais Award. Professor Kais will be introduced and interviewed by Dr. Sara Van Fleet, who I'm also pleased to see here with us today. She's an alumna of the University of Washington Anthropology Department. She is a former student of Professor Kais, and she's also the former managing director of the University of Washington Southeast Asia Center for, I believe it was 17 years. And she's here to lead our conversation on impermanence today. And finally, I would like to introduce Lori Hagman, who is executive editor at the University of Washington Press. She is a scholar of China in her own right and will speak a bit about the publication of the book after Sara and Biff's conversation. So Sara, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm so excited to see so many faces that are still familiar to me, but also the new faces of Southeast Asia program at the UW. It's just, it's so exciting to hear about the work that you're all doing, the awards, and just how vibrant the program continues to be. I miss you all. I miss that part of my life at the UW. It really was a highlight for me in terms of my career and my life. So it is my pleasure and honor to be able to interview Ajahn Biff Kais, Charles Kais, who as a new graduate student for us coming in, trying to call him Biff was the hardest thing, the hardest transition, to call him Biff as opposed to Professor Kais. But it's my pleasure to be able to interview him about his memoir, which is just coming out. And Lori will talk to you later about getting your hands on it at a discount for students. It's really a well-written book. I think you'll all really enjoy it, not just from the perspective of an anthropologist, life story of his work in Southeast Asia and in Asia, but also in terms of the University of Washington and the Southeast Asian Studies program, which is pretty much the house that he helped to build. So without further ado, I'm gonna read my questions, but I'm gonna try to also leave things open so that if you have any questions later, you might be able to ask him. But Biff and Jane, so nice to see you there in your lovely home in Portland. It's such an interesting book. I had to really sort of whittle it down to a few questions that I thought would also be relevant to the people who might not know you or your work so well. So I'm going to start with asking you, you had some of your first experiences as an outsider early in your life, Biff, particularly when you moved with your family from Nebraska to the predominantly Mormon town in Idaho. I'm asking, how did this influence your early years as an anthropologist trying to establish yourself in a small village in Northeast Thailand? And when did you know that you were being accepted as a community member instead of an outsider in that world?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here and seeing how the program has developed. And it's just really impressive. Thank you all, the students too, who were here. Okay, to answer your question, let me say first, as a child in a predominantly Mormon town in Idaho Falls, Idaho, I was acutely aware of cultural differences growing up. This would lead me as a student to decide to explore other cultures. I decided as a graduate student at Cornell to become focused on my research on Thailand. My major professor at Cornell was Lauriston Sharp, who had done pioneering work in rural Thailand. So Jane and I chose a village in northeastern Thailand called Ban Nong Tuen. I should say first, Jane is not only my wife, but she is my major collaborator and also my editor. We chose this village in northeastern Thailand. There was an old man in the village who used to come around every morning and say, "Why did you Farang," meaning Westerners, "come to live in this village?" And so we gave him the answers that we had, which were based on our own background. And then he came back one day and says, "I figured it out. In your past lives, you were villagers here. So I actually have a long history that I didn't even know about." This combined with my being asked to referee a boxing match in the village at a village fair led to our being fully accepted in the village. I still remember coming back one day, finding the district officer there, and I was in a pakoma, which is a loincloth, and I walked out. The villagers really appreciated that too.
So kind of building on that, Biff, how has the study of Thai society and culture shaped who you are as a person, both personally and professionally?
Well, I did my first field work in this village in northeastern Thailand, which was very basic, very fundamental to my identity as a researcher and as basically a person who was part of the village. I also did field work in a district bordering Burma in northwestern Thailand called Messerian. My whole life was reshaped by my working very closely with the district abbot, Buddhist abbot, who was very, very good. I very enjoyed him. From him, I got a deeper understanding of Buddhism as practiced in Thailand. And subsequent to that experience, I came to see the world in Buddhist terms, understand myself in that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason why I have the title of a book, Impermanence. Anicca.
So Biff, given the current political moment in this country and the upheavals around racial justice and police reform, how did your experience of the anti-Vietnam War movement and the student movement at UW in the early 1970s, how did that influence your teaching and the scholarship that you were doing?
When I began teaching at the University of Washington, there was no real anti-war movement at all. This was 1966. And there was I remember the first sit-in, student-run sit-in. I was only one of two faculty who showed up at that. That really began my involvement with being anti-war. But actually it started at Cornell. At Cornell, Jane's major professor and the leader of one of the professors at Cornell was George Cahan. And George Cahan had taken on a role of being a major spokesman in the anti-war movement in the United States. And so I would already had my ideas shaped by his advocacy.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I found it interesting too to hear about just the role that various professors took in that anti-war movement at UW, and it's a really interesting part of the book for those of you interested in that part of the history of the University of Washington. Terrific photographs throughout the book too, I've got to say, not just family photographs. But
many of them are by Jane.
Yes. Jane, you're an amazing photographer, really beautiful pictures. So Biff, you were AAS president in 2001.
Asian Studies.
Asian Studies, Association of Asian Studies president in 2001 and 2. And at that time, you awarded Jane Hanks, someone who you first met while you were a grad student at Cornell. You awarded her the Distinguished Contributions to Asian Studies Award. In your memoir, you spoke about her as, quote, a model and mentor for others through her written work and through her personal generosity. That sounds, from me as a former student of yours, that sounds a lot like who you are and who you were as a mentor and a graduate mentor and an advisor. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the students that you recruited over the course of your career, what they meant to you, and your efforts to build a more broad and inclusive Southeast Asian Studies program here at the UW.
I was very interested right at the time I joined the faculty at the University of Washington in recruiting students who were not from America. In fact, my first PhD student was an Afghan, Nazif Sharani, who I still maintain contact with. And as I began to really develop as a graduate mentor, I began to recruit more students, particularly from Thailand and Vietnam, and also some from Japan as well. And I really take great pride in the role that some of my former students play in their own professional associations in Thailand and Vietnam. We continue to hear from them. It's just really quite impressive. And I really find, like with you, Sarah, I really feel very close to my luksit, the Thai word which means student, but it also means child. And so I see all of you as my descendants as well.
I think Biff has always seen his students as a second family.
Yes, very much so.
Keeps up very close relationships with just about all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are very lucky to be part of that family, let me tell you. I remember that when you talked about your impressions during the early 70s with the students that you encountered, about how little they really understood about Southeast Asia and about the people of Southeast Asia. And that also sparked your thinking about broadening the program to include voices from Southeast Asia, not just as subjects, but as people who we were engaged with in conversations.
I started teaching my first course, I taught a course on Southeast Asia all through my career, but the first year I was teaching, there were very few students because they didn't know where Southeast Asia was and weren't interested in it. That changed.
Yeah. Good. Nice to see change for the better. Finally, Biff, could you tell us about your collaborator, editor, best friend, wife of 58 years, about Jane Keyes, and how her presence has influenced the content and nature of your work over the years?
Extraordinarily so. We met at Cornell. We were fellow graduate students at Cornell. And I courted her at Cornell, and then I asked her to marry me, and I said, "Are you willing to go live in a village in Thailand?" She said, "Oh yes, definitely." that was what really convinced me. Yes, she has been my companion, my editor, my critic, my best critic, ever since then.
Jane, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I found it wonderful working on the first two times, the times we were in Bandung Tern and again in Mesrian, where I was the photographer, because Biff would be so busy doing the interviewing that people would forget that you were closing in on them in those days with a long length camera, because we didn't have the equipment that we have now. Mm-hmm. And they weren't even aware of you. So it was a wonderful setting to be a photographer in. And of course, there were stunning rituals, stunning ceremonies, wonderful opportunities for portraiture. It just was a tremendous experience. I'll also add a little bit. Biff was an excellent interviewer. And at night, when we were living in Bandung Tern, we would retire at night under a mosquito net with a hurricane lamp inside, because of course there was no electricity. And Biff would write up his notes. And one time I'd been involved in the same interview. And so we had a competition. We said, all right, let's both go back and write up our notes and see how that works. And Biff had remembered probably twice as much as I did of that interview. He had amazing detail always and was very disciplined, always wrote up his research notes.
Wow.
I would like to also mention that many of our photographs that we took, or Jane took particularly, are in the UW archive. And these were, some of them made it to Facebook and were discovered by the daughter of the couple that we lived with in Bandung. That was just amazing. And so she's been in touch ever since, corresponding with us, with our older son, Nick. So really, it was quite an amazing.
I think it has been pleasing for some of the children today in Bandung, seeing photos of their grandparents and the very different lives that they led to what the generation does today. Mm.
So interesting. Does anyone have any questions or comments at this point?